All right, it looks like it's 2:30. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep. Hi.
Yes.
All right, I just want to make sure we have everybody assigned to the right roles. So I just want to start off with my introduction. My name's Sam Henson. I'm in the pharmaceutics department in the School of Pharmacy, and welcome to the Graduate Research Symposium. We have a couple speakers lined up today, and I'll be the moderator for this session. So just a few housekeeping items as we get started. Ask that we all mute ourselves when we're not speaking. I'll go ahead and introduce each speaker, and then the speakers, once you're introduced, you can go ahead and share your screen and begin your presentation. You'll have 15 minutes each, and just try to leave a little time at the end for questions. The audience members, we encourage you to be fully engaged. Feel free to ask questions at the end and put them in the chat, or just use your microphone. So our first speaker today is Sophia Bakar from the Bayer School of Natural and Environmental Sciences. Faculty advisor is David Collar, and they'll be presenting their research titled Hydrologic Modeling with Remote Sensing for Groundwater Resource Management within the Sand River Catchment, South Africa. So Sophia, take it away.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So as Sam said, my name is Sophia, and today I'll be presenting my master's thesis research titled Hydrologic Modeling with Remote Sensing for Groundwater Resources Management within the Sand River Catchment of South Africa. This project is part of a larger collaboration between the University of Venda in South Africa and Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in New York. So during this presentation, I'll give you guys a little bit of background information on my research, the objectives of my research, information about the study area, remote sensing and other data collected and analyzed, development of the model results, and some concluding remarks. There are two main areas of research that my project focuses on. The first involves remote sensing, which is data about objects or areas on Earth obtained from aircraft or satellites. These data can come from passive and active sensors, and the data products can come in several forms, including imagery, spatial data, digital elevation models, and reflected or emitted energy, also just sunlight. And these data are used in many different environmental applications, including flood and drought predictions, monitoring of forests, natural resources management, monitoring land subsidence, and water quality and quantity. The second area of research my project focuses on involves hydrologic modeling, which is the simulation of a flux, flow, or change of water within a watershed. This involves small-scale models, mathematical functions, and computer simulations. And these models are widely used to predict responses to changing stresses in the watershed, including groundwater extraction, droughts and floods, river flow patterns, or land use. And there are many different types of hydrologic models, and they vary based on climate and desired output in the region of interest. So the main objective of my project is to develop a hydrologic model to identify key recharge zones for groundwater resources along the Sand River in the Limpopo River Basin. And this will be accomplished in two parts. The first is to use remote sensing data for groundwater storage estimation. And the second is to develop and use a model integrated with the remote sensing data to quantify these groundwater resources for improved management within the watershed. And so my study area is the South Pensard Mountains, which lie within the Sand River catchment of the larger Limpopo River Basin. The Limpopo River Basin spans 4 countries, Mozambique, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, and supports approximately 18 million people and biodiversity. And so the freshwater resources are very critical here, especially groundwater. And so this map on the lower left shows in orange the Limpopo River Basin, in purple the Sand River catchment, and then the pink is the delineated sand river catchment within the South Pansy Mountains, which is my main study area. And then zoomed in here on the right, we have that delineated catchment overlaid with land use data. Land use data provides a good picture of where and how water is being used in the region, as well as information for curve number calculation, which supports infiltration measurements. The main remote sensing component I'll be using for this research is water storage estimates from NASA's Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment, or GRACE. This satellite mission involves 2 satellites that orbit Earth and operate by Newton's law of universal gravitation. The output is monthly changes in gravity that are caused by monthly changes in mass. And most of these monthly mass changes that are measured are caused by changes in deep water storage on the surface of the Earth. And their vertical extent is measured in centimeters of equivalent water thickness. This output can be used to represent groundwater storage, which is why we're interested in this remote sensing data product. Other data collected and used for this project include in situ precipitation from rain gauges across the Limpopo River Basin. Most of these rain gauges, or most of the precipitation data obtained from these gauges were from the South Africa Department of Water and Sanitation. We do have one monitoring station within the South Pansy Mountains, which provided most of the data for the model itself. But we had a larger amount of historical data from the South African Department of Water and Sanitation. We also had in situ runoff, again, from the Department of Water and Sanitation. Evapotranspiration was calculated according to this model outlined on the left, the advection aridity model. All the data for this model was obtained from our monitoring station in the South Pansy Mountains. And we use this method because it's been shown to effectively model evapotranspiration in arid and semi-arid regions like the climate here. Other data products that were used include water storage estimates from GRACE, plant canopy storage from the Global Land Data Assimilation System, soil moisture from the Global Land Data Assimilation System, terrain in the form of digital elevation images from the Shuttle Radar Topography Mission. All of these data products were used to do a preliminary analysis of what the groundwater was looking like in the region. So the first thing we did was observe water storage estimates compared to cumulative precipitation over a 10-year period. That is this graph on the left. And so the orange is water storage estimates from GRACE, the blue is water storage estimates from the Global Land Data Assimilation System, and the dotted blue is cumulative precipitation from the rain gauges. And so we just did this to see how peaks in groundwater storage lined up with peaks in cumulative precipitation and whether or not there were any trends. The second preliminary kind of analysis that we did was a water balance. And the in situ water balance is a simple input output where precipitation is an input, evapotranspiration and runoff were outputs. That's shown in this blue line here. And then the orange is the water storage estimates from the Global Land Data Assimilation System. And the gray is the water storage estimates from GRACE. And the water storage estimates outlined in this water balance are monthly over a 1-year period. And this is the 1-year period where we're modeling. And it's from August 2019 to August 2020. From there, we transitioned into the hydrologic model development. And I used the US Army Corps of Engineers AGC HMS hydrologic modeling software. And there are kind of 2 main components that I needed to do when using the software. The first was to input our in situ time series data. And for us, that was precipitation and the calculated evapotranspiration. And the second is data for the basin model elements. And so I inputted the digital elevation models as the terrain. The model, the AGC HMS software has built-in GIS functions. So once I inputted the terrain data, it processed the train data and showed, where the river flow was and where the subbasins were. And from there were three modeling methods that I inputted, and that was the SCS curve number infiltration method, which used the land cover data that you saw in the previous slides, then SCS unit hydrograph runoff river flow method, and then the base flow recession method. And this is what the model looks like when the terrain's been inputted. And so this is the delineated catchment that you saw in the first slides. And the subbasin we're most interested in is the subbasin 1 right here. This is because we have our monitoring station here, and this is where we suspect that there are groundwater resources not being monitored properly. So the first iteration, we kept this kind of larger watershed, and for the second iteration, we zoomed in specifically to that subbasin. And in this slide, I have our kind of final iteration results. The blue is the discharge that was obtained from the river gauge from the Department of Water and Sanitation. It's located right at the output of this subbasin. So that's this blue line. And then the red is the modeled flow through that subbasin. And as you can see, there is some difference, but what we are hypothesizing is that with all the inputs, we don't have a groundwater input because there is no groundwater data available for the region. So what we'd like to do next is see if our groundwater estimates, if we input them, if the flow will match up after we input the groundwater estimates. And so to conclude, we're hypothesizing that the South Pansering Mountains are acting as high elevation water towers with substantial groundwater resources that feed into the Sand River. Quantifying these resources is important for water management in the region. The model itself still needs to incorporate other areas of loss, potentially from plant canopy storage and soil moisture. These data are obtained via the Global Land Data Assimilation System and the GRS terrestrial water storage data. The other potential issue is that the base flow may not be accurately represented based on the flow data from the discharge gauge at Waterport. So it would be nice if we had a gauge right at that subbasin we're interested in. And then we also need to integrate the remote sensing into the model and then calibrate and validate it with as much in situ data as possible. Hopefully, I'll be done in May, but we're going to hopefully go to South Africa over the summer and be able to collect some of this data. And thanks for listening to my presentation. I'd like to acknowledge my department, Center for Environmental Research and Education, as well as the Water Q2 Project, USAID, and the Graduate Symposium organizers for letting me present. Thanks. Let me know if you have any questions.
All right, thanks, Sophia. Like you said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute your microphone and ask a question or put it in the chat and we can go through them. We'll give everybody a minute or so to think of their questions. I can start us off. I do have one question, just looking at the plot of your data there. So is this more of the data, the goal of this, data analysis and the model in general? Is it right now is more of like a monitoring approach? So we want to learn about the behavior. Would there ever be a time in this project or maybe somewhere down the road where the data from this model is used to inform an action? So is there anything we can do in response to what we see and what the data is predicting or what the model is predicting?
Sure. Yeah, we have quite a few stakeholders on the project who have, been working with us and identifying, where we're working and what kind of data outputs they're looking for. Ideally, we would use these results to help them inform, but right now we don't have enough confidence in these results. I think it would be fairly easy in the next 2 or 3 years to continue this and get those results. But originally this was supposed to be a fieldwork project where we would collect that data. So switching to computational, obviously there was some limitations there, and hopefully these model results can inform and support decision making. But that's a question probably for like a year from now, I guess.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Well, thank you. Any other questions before we move on? Seeing none. Well, thanks, Sophia. Nice presentation. Thanks for getting us started.
Thanks.
Our next speaker for this session is Jill Bodner from the McAnulty College and Graduate School of Liberal Arts. Their faculty advisor is Maggie Patterson, and they'll be presenting the project titled Righteous: What Holocaust Rescuers Can Teach Us About a More Altruistic Society.
Great.
Jill, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Great, thanks. Let me make sure I get the right window to share. Let's see. Can everyone see my presentation?
Looks good.
Okay, super. And I'm gonna hopefully be able to show a little bit of my website too. So hopefully that works out too. So I wanted to thank everybody for having me. I actually graduated just this past December, and my advisor, Maggie Patterson, really encouraged me to submit my project to the symposium. So thank you to Mary and everybody else for accommodating someone who just graduated. It's a pleasure to be here. And so my MFA project, it was a capstone project and a multimedia project. So I'll be walking through that. My committee, my main advisor was Maggie Patterson from the media department. And then I also had Professor Don Ma from the media department on my committee. He was really instrumental to the video and audio component of my multimedia project. And then Dr. Marie Baird from the theology department was also on my committee. Professor Patterson introduced me to her. She was just an incredible resource with her involvement in Jewish studies and Holocaust studies and in Holocaust rescuer studies. So she was just absolutely wonderful to be able to work with. And it was really nice being able to have kind of an integrated interdepartmental involvement. So that was really fun for me and I learned a lot. The purpose of my project was to introduce the bravery of Holocaust rescuers who risked their lives to save Jewish people from the Holocaust in World War II. And I focused on highlighting 5 different rescuers from 4 different European countries. And I used their stories to highlight the importance of remembering stories from the Holocaust and from World War II, and to define who were these Holocaust rescuers and the other ones that were like them. And something really interesting that I discovered along the way was that there was an actual science of research behind these rescuers' altruism. And then I tried to kind of close the circle, a large circle about, well, what's going on with Holocaust education today, and do they bring what these rescuers did into Holocaust education today? So my deliverables, I wrote a kind of a literary research paper, PDF. I had to get all that information out of my head and onto paper. So that's the first place to always start. And then I developed a project website for all the multimedia components. And let's see, I'll try to link out to that and see. Let's see, can you see the website?
Yep, I think that's what we're seeing now.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I put together a website for all the multimedia components, and I took the the research paper that I did, and I broke it up into different chapters. And so this is kind of a much more digestible way for the story to be read. I have it broken into different chapters. And then the reader can go into each of the different chapters and read the story. And then I integrated all sorts of archival photos, and then I put together videos, and then as well as archival testimony footage from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Their online archive was just absolutely tremendous. And so I spent weeks and weeks of research going through that and watching videos and transcribing videos and harvesting some little clips out of that to bring into my research. And then also so that these people's voices could be heard and seen, because that's a really important part of making people aware of their stories. And then something else that was really important for me to be able to help relay these stories was to put together maps. I have a background in GIS and in mapping, not quite the remote sensing that Sophia does, but it was really important for me to be able to use maps to tell a story. So I put together what are called map stories. And so the user can scroll through the map stories and look at what a map of Europe in 1944 looked like, and what the different influence of the Nazi regime looked like, and where the Allies were, and then scroll along, and the map changes to go along with the text of the story that I put together. And then it also has photos and videos and everything to go along with the map story. And so this is also a really nice, easily digestible way for different people to have access to the story. Some people just like to read, some people like to watch videos and have photos to kind of help provide context to the story. So this is another kind of nice alternative way for people to learn about these important stories. Let's see. So are we back to my PowerPoint? Can you just let me know that we're back to that? Thank you. Okay. So we'll just continue with my PowerPoint. So who were Holocaust rescuers? They really didn't come into the public's conscious until the 1960s, because after World War II, everyone really wanted to forget everything that happened, and even the survivors of the Holocaust. But in the 1960s, the Yad Vashem World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Israel was given the assignment of collecting stories of survivors and from rescuers. And so their historians started collecting all of these stories. And one of the important reasons why they didn't want these stories to disappear is that they wanted to make a case that that Europe didn't necessarily go through this complete moral paralysis in allowing the Jews to suffer during the Holocaust and be murdered. The Yad Vashem wants to make a point that no, there were these people, although there weren't many, who did stand up to the Nazi regime and risk their lives to save people. They were out there, and we want to recognize them. And Yad Vashem continued to define what altruism is and what their altruistic deeds were. And they defined it as helping one another voluntarily at a considerable cost and without the expectation of external reward. Because during the time, if you were found to be harboring Jews or helping Jews in any way, the Nazis would execute you right there on the spot, or send you to a camp, or sometimes even just burn your entire village. So there was definitely consequences to helping people. Their further criteria for rescuers is that they risk their life to save Jews from deportation and death. That it was rooted in a humanitarian concern, not money. Some people did try to profit over saving Jews or hiding them, or even taking them over into neutral territory, like to Switzerland. They were not allowed to harm Jews while they were under their care, and that there's historic testimony and documentation from a survivor to back up and verify that the rescuer did these heroic acts. And these acts included sheltering Jews, hiding them, obtaining new identities like passports, false identification, and then transportation. And once Yad Vashem goes through all the interviews and documentation to verify if someone is considered righteous among the nations, there's a ceremony in Israel at their headquarters. They're awarded a medal, a plaque. plant a tree in their name. It's a big ceremony with any of the survivors that are still alive. The rescuers, their families are invited for this great ceremony. And as of January 2021, almost 28,000 righteous among the nations have been verified. And I have that little asterisk there because it's important to note that we'll never know how many there really were. Most people didn't talk about what happened during the war afterwards. People didn't know that it was something to be recognized about. They didn't think they did anything special. Many people died and the stories were taken with them. So we'll never know. But some researchers think it could have been in the hundreds of thousands of rescuers that helped Jewish people. But still in the context that in Europe in World War II, there were about 300 million Europeans, and most of them acted as bystanders and did nothing to help. So for my research, I focused on 4 different countries. One was occupied Poland, which had the worst decimation of Jewish people in Nazi occupation. And there I highlighted rescuer Jan Karski, who was a spy for the Allies. And then a separate Jewish person who operated on her own was Irene Opdijk. And then in Denmark, I highlighted Knud Dyby, who was instrumental in what was called the Danish Boat Network, where they literally ferried Jewish people in Denmark over the water across to Sweden and saved almost their entire population of Jewish people. And then in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, I highlight Tina Strobos and her family, her mother Marie, who were instrumental in the Dutch underground in Amsterdam. And then in Italy, I highlight the rescuer, his name was Gino Bartoli, and he was the gateway for me knowing about this story. He was a champion cyclist in Italy, well, in the world in the 1930s and 40s. And it wasn't until just around when he started getting older and passed away in 2000 that it was revealed that he was a Holocaust rescuer, and he had worked with what was called the Assisi Network, which was a collaboration of churches and monasteries throughout Italy. So as I was researching Holocaust rescuers and talking with Dr. Baird, I discovered that in the 80s, scientists actually wanted to know what was the root of why they did what they did. What they said was because they were just doing the right thing. It was the right thing to do. Sociologists and psychologists really wanted to understand, well, what made them do this? And so they did a lot of research, and it's still going on today. But 4 instrumental researchers in the 80s who started this were Sam and Pearl Oliner, Eva Fogelman, and Nahak Matek. And I'm just giving a general overview of some of their discoveries, but some of their most important discoveries were parental influence. It's really important that these rescuers had role models, whether they were parents or another close adult who could model like the goodness in people, that we treat everybody fairly, and that they have those kind of values. They were raised with those kind of values. Rescuers had a predisposition to action. So if somebody showed up at their door, a Jewish person showed up at their door, they would take action right there. They wouldn't mull it over or think, what should I do? Their family or themselves had a history of altruism and helping other people. They had a concept of universalism. So everybody was treated the same. There was no difference in who you were depending on your religion or your ethnicity. There was a concept of what was called the rescuer self, which was a kind of a psychological transformation that the rescuer would go through to validate their actions. And, you know, someone who might be just quiet, you might just see on the street or at the bakery, you know, is someone whose life is now embedded in lies and sometimes even in murder to protect these people that they're trying to save. The rescuers learned to think independently, so not going the way of the bystanders, not just doing what they were told to do, which is really, really critical. They were critical thinkers. They saw what needed to be done and they did it based on their moral convictions. And then moral motivations, there are numerous different moral motivations that the rescuers might have had, ideological motivations, religious motivations, whether they were part of a network of other like-minded people who wanted to make acts of resistance against the Nazis. And so I also looked at, well, what does Holocaust education look like today? Are they, you know, using things that you might learn from the rescuers? And one of the key things I learned is is that Holocaust education today use the phrase trauma doesn't teach. So it's not about statistics in history class about how many people died and photos of concentration camps, things that really just shut people down, and especially kids in elementary school or in high school. So while it is important to know the truth, Holocaust educators now are also teaching them stories of the survivors and the rescuers. They're teaching students to learn about building empathy and tolerance for other people. And I learned that students today have much more openness about mental health and wanting to talk about that. So when they learn these stories of resistance from the rescuers and from Jewish people and how they lived through this time and thinking that they're going to die, and their resilience, that really means a lot for the students to learn about. And then finally, students today tend to be much more atheist, and so it's important for them to learn that religion doesn't necessarily equate with morals. One of the rescuers I highlight was Tina Strobos in the Netherlands, and her family was devoutly atheist. She talks about it all the time, that they didn't have any kind of religion, but they were some of the most they had the strongest morals of anybody that you would ever meet. So having that kind of role model is important for students to learn from. And then I wanted to talk about talk to actual high school teachers and how they're teaching about the Holocaust. So I highlight high school teacher Nick Haberman from Shaler Area High School and the incredible work that he's doing with his students and actually all around Western Pennsylvania. He was the Holocaust Educator of the Year in 2018. And then you can't talk about this without talking about the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh and the work that they do. And I talk about their comic book series, which is called Hutzpah, which is a really incredible resource where students can learn through these stories the fact that survivors and rescuers were actually superheroes because they overcame traumatic experiences. The readers can learn about these experiences and build empathy towards them, just as comic books have done for readers for decades. And so that's my project in a nutshell. So thank you very much for having me. And that is my website right there, where I have the project of my rescuer work.
All right, thank you, Joe. A great presentation.
Thanks.
Same as before, we'll open it up for questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and unmute your microphone or put it in the chat, and we'll give everyone a minute or so to line up their questions.
I have a comment.
Oh, hello, Dr. Barrett.
I'm here.
Hello.
I just wanted to, of course, I know this work. I think it's absolutely outstanding. And I hope that it achieves very wide availability. I just wanted to offer a comment in agreement with something that you said that I haven't really talked with you about before. And that is that the number of rescuers is probably much higher than Yad Vashem is able to tabulate. And the reason I say that, I lived in the Netherlands in the 1970s. And in the course of living there and going to school there and making friends and so forth and so on, I met a number of my friends' parents, but especially grandparents, who in fact did engage in acts of rescue, but never considered it to be anything other than doing the right thing in ordinary life, even though they understood that the stakes were really quite high, but they felt that they could do things without getting caught. And for the most part, they were able to do that. So just to point out that almost 28,000 number of rescuers that Yad Vashem has been able to positively identify is in fact probably a good deal larger, but that does not take away from the 300 million Europeans, most of whom stood by. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just agreeing with you and knowing that this is probably the case from personal experience.
Yeah, definitely. One of the video clips that I highlight is from Jan Karski in one of his interviews, and he was talking about how there were probably, and he's very gesticulates, and hundreds of thousands, but we'll never know. And so, yeah, that's unfortunate. And I talk about that quite a bit in my paper, but yeah, it's important to look at the perspective of how many did not help, and especially with what's going on with Ukraine now. It's important for everybody to be aware.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hey, Jill, I just wanted to say thank you for your meaningful work.
Thank you.
I was sitting there listening to it. It just made me realize, like, we don't learn the stories and accounts you were talking about in school, and we should, because they're so important to what is being talked about. So I want to say thank you to you for bringing those things up and being willing to talk about them. I learned a lot from that.
Okay.
So thank you for
Right.
sharing
Thank-
that. I'm also
Thank you.
really,
It's hard to put it in 15 minutes, so thank you.
Sure. And I was really impressed by your website as well, how you tied in the map, and that brings some more life to the accounts. I thought that was really impressive. I'm going to check that out. So
Oh, please do. Thank you.
thank you so much.
That's kind of how my brain works, is like I'm a visual person.
Yeah.
So, and I have a background in mapping, so it was important for me to bring in maps, but especially because Americans are so distant from Europe. Europe is over there somewhere, and World War II is even farther away. So any way that we have to have people learn and provide that tether between, how Europe was 80 years ago and what's going on is so important. And again, with Ukraine, Irene Updike, who I highlighted, she was basically in occupied Ukraine. And so it really was a lesson to me and made me so much more empathetic with what's going on today without having had done this. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
So it looks like we did get one question in the chat. I'll go ahead and read that for those that aren't seeing the chat. The question is, did you see any trends in your research that suggested that socioeconomic status contributed to who were the rescuers?
Oh, that's a great question. From what I read, no, there is no pattern. And that's something that the researchers wanted to look at. And that's something that they also tried to kind of do in their analysis, that there was absolutely no trend at all. It was all walks of life. Yeah, there's one quote, one slide I didn't include just to try to shorten it up, but they came from all walks of life. They were doctors, bankers, peasants, farmers, a womanizer, a murderer. I mean, literally all walks of life. It had to do with the core of who they were and what their values were. And it's, regardless of your socioeconomic status.
That's great. Thank you. All right. Any final questions before we move on?
Hi, Jill?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Hi, it's Maggie.
Hello.
Hi, I just wanted to say how proud I am of what you did, and we started with such a thin strand. This tape that you were interview that you had been unable to translate, and how you gradually developed this idea and brought in Don Ma to help you with so many of the production parts, and then Marie Baird, who way broadened our knowledge of the whole phenomenon of rescuing. And what a tribute to you to keep following all these trails. And my job was to kind of tell you to keep your focus, because there were so many different directions you could go in.
Oh,
and
yeah, this could be a lifetime project for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you did a great job at doing that. And I'm really amazed and proud of what you've accomplished.
Well, thank you. I mean, the faculty at Duquesne everybody was just phenomenal. So it was a real pleasure, a real treat. And, I couldn't have done it without any of you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very, very much. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
We will go ahead and move on to our last speaker, which is Carrie Dancer from the Bayer School of Natural and Environmental Sciences. Their advisor is Lindsay Ferrara, and they'll be presenting a project titled Examining What Successful Reentry Looks Like, Looking Beyond Recidivism Rates to the Human Experience. So Carrie, you can go ahead and share your screen.
My apologies, I hit the wrong button. I got a little click happy there. All right, hi everyone. My name is Carrie Dancer, and as Sam said, I'll be discussing examining what successful reentry looks like, looking beyond recidivism rates to the human experience. For some background, a returning citizen is an individual that is returning home after prison, and the term returning citizen is used to replace terms such as ex-con and ex-felon to erase the stigma behind the terms. And in 2020 alone, there were 45,120 people in Pennsylvania's prison systems, and there were 1.8 million people incarcerated nationwide. Roughly 95% of the prison population will be released at one point in time, and it is predicted that 650,000 people are released from prison each year. Recidivism rates are currently used to determine how likely a person is to reoffend, and it's the success rate of the individuals and the programs that these individuals attend. And it can imply that a person has committed a new crime or simply violated parole or probation. And just some background on parole, it's where offenders are conditionally released from prison and they serve the remainder of their term in the community, and this is decided by a parole board. However, probation is where offenders are placed under supervision in the community, and this is done through a probation agency and it's decided by the courts. However, people on probation are not really sentenced to prison. They just go right into the community. And at one point, there were 110,932 people on federal community supervision, 897 were on parole, and 14,658 were on probation. This led to my research question, can successful reentry be defined? And the follow-up question is, what barriers impacted returning citizens the most? So my study was broken down into 3 phases, and phase 1 was the literature review, where I dove into the literature and looked at prison statistics, barriers that returning citizens face, and just anything I could find about recidivism and what these individuals go through. Phase 2 was conducting interviews with returning citizens, and phase 3 was analyzing these interviews, and that's what I will focus on today. So my methods for phase 2 were to interview returning citizens, and this was conducted through Zoom in a one-to-one fashion. But once COVID restrictions lifted, I was able to conduct one in-person interview. And the third phase was to observe common themes with the data through MaxQDA, which is a text analysis software. My interview process was 9 questions, and they were all open-ended as I wanted the individual to basically tell me anything that they were willing to tell me about their reentry. And the first 3 questions were demographic questions, like how long were you in prison, how old you were when you were released, and how long it has been since they were released. The 4th question was asking about the resources and if they were offered any upon their release. And then I got into the nitty-gritty part where I asked them about successful reentry, how they would characterize unsuccessful reentry, and how they would even characterize their own reentry to see if they put themselves in a successful or unsuccessful category. Then I asked these individuals the toughest barrier that they had to face, and if there was anything that was expected to be a problem when they were reentering. So for my results. First 3 questions were demographic, like I said. The individual that served the most time in prison was individual R3. They served 33 years, with the shortest sentence being R7. They only served 2 years. The oldest individual when they were released was R7 at the age of 60, and the youngest was R10 at the age of 26. In the time since release, the shortest sentence was, or shortest time, excuse me, was R7. They were recently released within 2.5 years ago, and the longest release was R10 17 years ago. So when I asked these individuals if they were offered any resources, I was surprised by this response. 5 were not offered any. 1 individual had to ask their parole or probation officer for resources, and once they asked, they did receive help. And 2 were offered aid, and this was either the Veterans Administration or a halfway house. And this was just surprising, as most people think that when a returning citizen is being reentered, they're offered resources or some sort of assistance. Whenever I did my coding for the MaxQDA, I broke everything down into 3 main categories, such as essentials, progress, and community, as you can see here. And it just made it easier to answer all of these questions. So I'm going to stick with coding throughout the next 3 questions. And when I asked them how they would characterize successful reentry, they talked about having essentials like house and a job, committing to better oneself, thriving in all aspects of life, and continuing on with one's life and not letting their prison sentence or prison time really impact them, and also having a support system and joining back into the community. For unsuccessful reentry, it was pretty much the opposite of what they said for successful, where they would be, where they considered them to be homeless and unemployed as unsuccessful, going back to prison, returning to old habits, and not even giving oneself a chance to succeed and really try. And for community, having a lack of support and systematic failures, where we can see the systematic failures with the results portion, as 5 of the 8 were not offered any resources. So when I asked them how they would characterize their own reentry, I was really curious to see what they would say, considering if they would put themselves in a successful category or they would completely avoid the question altogether. They kind of did a mix of both. They all said it was a long process, that support systems really made a difference with their reentry, and that they had to be honest with themselves and how they got here and the progress that they're going to have to make if they want to continue to be out in the community. One individual even said seamless, but they all in a way said seamless once they got their feet on the ground and were able to continue making progress. And a few individuals even considered it successful, which was surprising, as I didn't think they would characterize their reentry. So I asked these individuals the toughest barrier that they had to overcome. Housing was a big one, which is, if you look in the literature, is one of the main hurdles that returning citizens face, as private landlords do not want to rent to anybody with a criminal background. Progress was bettering oneself. A lot of them said that themselves was a barrier, like they had to be okay with the decisions that they had to make and the progress that they were making. And if the progress was going slower than they expected, they couldn't be frustrated. And the community itself, with the stigmas and labels and friends turning their back, and even a few individuals talked about church turning their back on these individuals because of their past. I asked these individuals if there was anything that was expected to be a problem when they were reentering that wasn't. A few of them said housing was surprisingly really easy and they weren't expecting that. Individuals all talked about acclimating to a new environment, as they had to go from a tiny prison cell to basically having the whole world in their hands, being released and having so much space and to deal with family and everybody again. It was really a new environment for them to get used to. Employment, a few of them found jobs rather quickly. A few individuals had ups and downs and problems every step of the way, and that they said everything that was really expected to be a problem was a problem. One individual even talked about their probation not being a problem. Most times probation is a problem, as if they violate it, they can be sent back to prison. However, this individual got the help that they needed through their probation officer and was able to re-enter society. These are just some of the coding results. So when I analyzed the interviews for segments, I looked for keywords to make the 3 main themes of community, essentials, and progress, but I broke those down into further themes to really grasp what these individuals were talking about. So for essentials, it was essentials, which some of them just flat out said essentials. Some talked about basic needs, which were finding a job, getting a house, having transportation, and access to food. Some talked about individual needs, which are really like health related, mental health, their own health, and just getting anything that they felt they needed at the time that wasn't job, transportation, food. And then lack of needs, I lumped those, all the needs together, because they are all a need individual, and how this was more related to unsuccessful reentry of the lack of needs, but we can see the basic needs was the most essential thing for them. As for progress, this one was very interesting and very a broad range. They talked about bettering oneself to move forward and having an action plan to do so, being frustrated with the progress, unwilling to move forward, which led to rearrest. And they all said the decisions they had to make were an ongoing process to make it successful. But the most common themes for this one were bettering oneself, moving forward, and rearrest. The same goes for community. Community was really the community around them, and this could be anybody. This could be walking outside on Duquesne's campus, that would be considered the community. Support was anybody that was really willing to help the individual, whether it be life coaches, family, or friends. And again, family was its own branch, as this could be family was helping them or family was going against them. And then alienation, all of them felt that if their friends and family turned the backs on them, they would be alienated, which would lead to a huge adjustment. So with these in mind, I made a proposed definition of successful reentry. And the proposed definition is the experiences of an individual who is returning home from prison with community support and basic needs that are essential to better oneself so he or she does not reoffend. Just a brief overview. Overall, resources were not offered as often as believed. Successful reentry is having a home, getting employment, and joining back into the community with a support system. Unsuccessful reentry is unemployed, homeless, rearrest, and lack of support. When I asked about their reentry, they just basically said it was a long, ongoing process. And the toughest barrier was adjusting back into the community and adjusting to everybody around them and even themselves. Unexpected problems were a new environment and employment. And again, just to reiterate the definition, the experiences of an individual who is returning home from prison with community support and basic needs that are essential to better oneself so he or she does not reoffend. There were some limitations to this study. Time was a huge one. These interviews took anywhere from a half an hour to an hour, and then to transcribe the interviews, take out any identifying information, and then put them in Max QDA to analyze, took anywhere from 2 to 3 hours for each interview. So this was very time consuming. Population is also a limitation in the study. This study is very small. There's only 8 individuals, and the number of returning citizens willing to talk about their experience is very limited and very small. So to get even 8 individuals, I thought was very impressive. And in the study itself, I had 2 females and 6 males. So that's an imbalance of population in the study, and female returning citizens could face different barriers. And also the comfortability of these individuals. Reentry is a tough, traumatic time, and so is prison. These individuals may not have been comfortable discussing everything with me, especially since I haven't experienced reentry or even being in prison. So they may have held some information back, but to be honest, I don't know if we'll ever know everything about reentry if these individuals are talking about it. So some future directions are to conduct more interviews with female returning citizens in general, potential parole and probation officers to see how the system's definition of success varies, and even returning citizens that were released during COVID to see how resources vary. And this future directions could include refining the definition of successful reentry, as this definition is not set in stone. It can change with the different needs and resources offered for returning citizens. So just conclusions, common themes have been observed for barriers, successful and unsuccessful reentry. Each individual's reentry experience has been different, and that can be seen across the 8 interviews that I've conducted. More can be done to help those reenter, especially since not many were offered resources upon their release. A better method for success stories can be used, as recidivism is not reliable, as it encompasses parole and probation violations. And again, for the definition, the experiences of an individual who is returning home with community support and basic needs that are essential to better oneself so he or she does not reoffend. I'd like to acknowledge Farrar Research Group and Dr. Lindsay Farrar, because I know she's here, and the think tank and the returning citizens for this. And any questions?
All right, thanks, Carrie. We'll go ahead and, same as last time, if you have a question, go ahead and unmute or put it in the chat. We'll give everyone a minute to get their questions ready. Just while we're waiting, I have one question just from your perspective. You mentioned the lack of resources as a pretty significant issue for re-entering citizens. If you were to have the means to provide one specific resource that could help attain one of the needs of re-entering citizen, where would you kind of place the priority as far as what resource do you think could be most beneficial?
Honestly, that's a tough one, because most beneficial resources are a case-by-case basis. Like with that expected problems question, a lot of individuals thought housing was going to be an issue, and that's, according to the literature, that and employment are the 2 toughest for them to overcome. So if anything, I would dedicate resources to finding housing for them, or even employment, because most employers will not hire anybody with a criminal background.
Makes sense. Thank you for that. We did get one question in the chat here. And the question is, did any of your participants discuss recidivism?
Apologies, I hit the wrong button again. They discussed more of rearrest instead of recidivism, and they viewed it as rearrest either. They didn't really mention parole or probation violations, but more so committing the same crime. So violations weren't even on their mind when they mentioned anything about rearrest.
Hey, Carrie, really appreciate your work. One question I thought of, you did mention at one point that some of the re-entering citizens you talked with, that they were surprised that they were able to get housing. Because that's something I've heard, like you said, throughout the literature, it's notoriously difficult for re-entering citizens to get housing, and that's a basic need. You know, are there starting to be more programs in place for this, or maybe was their experience kind of an outlier experience? Just from what you know, is there more like programs being put in place to help with this need?
There are, but there aren't. Again, it comes down to being offered help as soon as they re-enter, because a lot of these poor returning citizens are unaware of the resources out there. So once they're released, they're on their own. So there are more programs for them. And I know Allegheny County Anchored Reentry Consortium, who I work with, they help individuals find housing, but we're not an organization that like takes them in and like gives them housing. We just help them find the resources that can give them housing. So there are more programs like ACAR out there that can help the individual find resources that they need.
All right, thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions before we conclude here? All right, seeing none. Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank all the speakers today. It was just great presentations all around. And thank you to everyone that attended this meeting and the symposium overall. It was a nice week of graduate research and looking forward to seeing the progress everyone makes in the future. So again, thank you guys all for attending and everyone enjoy the weekend.
Great, thanks so much. Have a good weekend.